Welcome back to Watts the Obsession True Crime. In this video, I am going to begin reading to you the book, The Girls of Summer. Well, the first book from the series, The Girls of Summer, written by my friend and famous true crime author, Kathleen McKenna Hewtson. The first book is about Nichol Kessinger. Nicole Kessinger was Chris Watts' mistress, the mistress that he was seeing when he, perhaps with the help of another, annihilated his family, his 15-week pregnant wife, Shanann Watts, his 4-year-old daughter, Bella Watts, and his 3-year-old daughter, Cece Watts, on August 13th, 2018. The next two books in this series will be focusing on the infamous, now walking free, potential daughter murderer, Casey Anthony, and Jodi Arias, who is serving time in prison for murdering her boyfriend, Travis Alexander. I first would like to read you the dedication of this book, and I would like you to know that Kevin, who is mentioned in this dedication, is one of the moderators for this channel, Watts the Obsession, and is a good friend of mine, and is a wonderful wealth of knowledge when it comes to information about the oil fields. As some of you may know, the bodies of Shanann, Celeste, and Bella were found in an oil field, Survey 319, a couple days after the murders in August of 2018. The dedication says, "This book is dedicated to all the surviving family members of these tragedies. Bless your sweet broken hearts. I'd also like to thank my good friend Kevin, who shone as a big oil click light on those oil tanks for me so I could better understand how it happened. To my sweet pal Kelly, that's me, keep up the good fight over at Watts the Obsession. To all of you who seek justice, that's you. Thank you for giving voices to those who can no longer speak for themselves. To Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico, you are always in my heart and in the hearts of millions, and that's all of us. Last but not least, to Tim, who turns lead into gold and makes every day worth living. I love you, baby." And that's Kathleen's husband, and he's great. Chapter 1. There's a quote from the song The Boys of Summer by Don Henley. "Nobody on the road, nobody on the beach. I'm driving by your house, though I know you're not home." Hello, reader pals. It's 2025 and it's still winter, and I'm optimistically setting out to write about some girls of summer. What is a, quote, girl of summer, end quote, you may ask? Well, she's a girl you will see on the beach and at clubs, the fun, wild girl who's down for anything, and she usually looks amazing in a bikini. In this book, my 3 girls of summer were implicated in some of the most disgusting crimes in our United States nation's history, all committed appropriately during the summer months. But only one of them is serving time for it. She is in Arizona, and her name is Jodi Arias. The second, Casey Anthony, was acquitted of the crime of killing her little girl and is enjoying life in Tennessee, where even her lawyer, Jose Baez, admits she did it. The third, Nichol Kessinger, is somewhere out there in our vast, lovely country, living her best life, despite the fact that tens of millions of Americans, and I'm one of them, are pretty sure she was deeply involved in the family murders of Chris Watts' pregnant wife and their 2 little girls. I generally write about white people, usually with money, who kill each other, usually to get more money. This is not a good reason to kill someone. In fact, it's a terrible reason to kill any living human being. But people have been doing wacky stuff for money since money got invented, and unless we all start living in caves again, I don't see that changing. However, these 3 ladies that I'll be talking about didn't kill for money. Indeed, what they likely killed for is still a head scratcher. And I've got another head scratcher for you. When will states stop demanding the death penalty in cases involving pretty young women? I'm not saying that only big hulking uggos living in dumpsters should die for murdering someone, but let's get real. Juries are not going to be comprised only of women, and no man is going to vote for the state to kill a beautiful young woman. So why waste the state's time and our taxpayer dollars trying for it? I'm revisiting the ever so charming Casey Anthony and her case because hers was the first big loss for a state, Florida this time, since O.J. Simpson murder trial that took place in Los Angeles, California in 1995. I'll go into details in her portion of the book, but in brief, Casey, a hot, pretty girl, felt trapped and annoyed at having a child at all, and seemed much happier and freer than she had been for a while after the tragic death of her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee. Then, when she was arrested and charged with murder, she was forced into long, boring trial, when all she really wanted to do was put that tiresome single mom thing behind her. Her lawyer, Jose Baez, said that her little girl, Kaylee, drowned in the backyard pool, which is sadly the kind of tragedy that goes down a lot in the summer in every state that has pools and good weather. But she wraps her dead child's head up in duct tape, drives around in the heat, partying at clubs with her child's corpse in the trunk, and eventually, when the smell gets too bad, dumps her off in the dirt on the side of a remote road. Okay, that seems reasonable, right? Oh my God. Anyway, the state of Florida decided this was a death penalty case and spent several $1,000,000, which would have been better allocated to, say, sinkhole repair, and not only miss getting the death penalty for her actions, but ended up losing everything when Casey was set free to dance again. Casey didn't even bother to testify, which was a good call by both her and her brilliant attorney because she is undoubtedly a liar of legendary proportions. Instead, Jose Baez just had her sit there wearing pink and batting her long lashes, knowing correctly that at least one man would hang that jury, and that likely a group of them would push her for full acquittal, which is what happened. So bringing the death penalty into play was proved to be a serious mistake. After all, how could such a pretty little thing have really meant to kill anyone? And no man, short of a psychopath, could bring himself to vote for her execution, no matter what she has done. The state of Arizona had more success with the killer queen Jodi Arias, another hot girl. She got dumped, sort of, by her boyfriend Travis Alexander, who, like many men before him, decided that craziness in bed wasn't enough of a deal closer to put a ring on it. This annoyed Jodi, who kept sleeping with him, but was resentful of her newly acquired lowly status of secret hookup girl, as Travis was, by then, too embarrassed to be seen with her in front of his friends. He didn't, however, see a problem in their continued play dates and certainly didn't recognize Jodi's growing rage, although she must have done so all too late on June 4th, 2008, while Jodi was violently butchering him after a last hookup. It seems that the state of Arizona had this one. Unlike the poor little skeleton, all that was left of Kelly Anthony, the state of Florida had, by the time her corpse was found, the state of Arizona had the single most bloody slaughter scene probably ever created outside a war zone. In fact, the murder of Travis Alexander made horror franchise killings look G-rated. There was hardly an inch of Travis Alexander's body that wasn't stabbed, cut, or shot, and there was more blood that had oozed or spurted out of his body than had remained in it. No one could see those pictures and not feel sick, and not feel that justice needed to come down on the killer. But the juries in her two horrendously expensive death penalty cases had men on them, and no such census was reached to put that pretty little thing to death. Maybe Travis pushed her into doing it. I'll posit that if Jodi Arias had looked like Charles Manson or even Marilyn Manson in drag, they would have killed her because, wow, did she kill him. But she didn't look like that at all. She looked very attractive, so yet another state wasted money on trying to hold an attractive young woman to full accountability, instead of using that money on much-needed highway repairs in a state where the heat turns its roads into endless adventure of car suspensions. Still, Jodi Arias was finally found guilty in a third trial when the death penalty was removed from the table, and is now laughing in prison, cheered only by the adoration of thousands of her fans and maybe a few doting prison guards. Jodi Arias, unlike Casey Anthony, did not listen to her lawyer and insisted on taking the stand. annoying the hell out of people nationwide, like for the whole 18 days going on 200 years, as if time were passing in dog years. I figured that she was found guilty and given life in prison for many reasons, not the least of which being that the jury probably felt some personal animosity towards her for being forced to listen to her all that time. My fantasy scenario is that she will one day share a cell block with Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt and bore them to death slowly. It is now time for me to talk about Nichol Kessinger. But before I do so, let me say this. If the state of Colorado ever gets around to charging her with, well, anything she gets on the stand and lets out one of her you just want to hide under the bed giggles, she might be the first of my girls of summer to actually get the death penalty. Colorado, oh, we all love Colorado. It's so beautiful and the whole place looks like a bad hotel painting. It's got everything you could want in terms of scenery and fun and good air and activities. And even people there are freakishly good looking. It's our country's Mecca. It's also a very fine place to murder someone and try to get away with it by making the world's stupidest and or most inconsistent story. You might not even have to miss a day skiing or mountain biking to the inconvenience of being arrested. Let's all remember little JonBenet Ramsey. Granted, her family didn't go skiing or mountain biking, but they were able to fly off and hang out in their second home. And to this day, no arrest has ever been made. And it looked like the same thing was going to happen in the case of Suzanne Morphew. Supposedly, a mountain lion kidnapped her, killed her, and then buried her twice, which all makes sense, doesn't it? Her spouse, Barry, was arrested for a hot minute, but quickly released. And because all that pesky nonsense made him miss several days of his chosen sport, shooting chipmunks, he filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the state. Well, I should think so. Eventually, he dropped his case, and that seemed to be that. For a long time, not a single Colorado mountain lion was arrested or even questioned, leaving all of them out there free to kill again, I guess. But in June 2025, Barry Morphew was arrested again, and we'll see what happens there and whether he decides to cling on to his murderous mountain lion defense. I think that could well be my next book. The state of Colorado got wise in the case of the murder of beautiful little boy Gannon Stouch. The woman who murdered him was his stepmother, Letitia Stouch. And although she is really fugly and weird looking, the state only demanded life in prison for her crime, and she was convicted. But see, 18 months before Letitia Stouch, the ultimate wicked stepmother killed Gannon. There was another terrible murder in Colorado, and a woman who could reasonably have been assumed to have been heavily implicated in it has never been arrested or even troubled at all, beyond a few jaw-droppingly friendly interviews conducted by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. She was pretty, and during the summer of 2018, she could rock a bikini. She also knew her way around a tube of KY jelly for her boyfriend's ultimate satisfaction. Her name is Nichol Kessinger, Nikki to her pals, and she was a girlfriend of Chris Watts, the confessed murderer of his entire family. Having known Chris for anything up to a year, she is my first girl of summer. Part 1, Nichol Kessinger, Cruel Summer of 2018. Chapter 2, and there's a quote, "And it's new, the shape of your body, it's blue, the feeling I've got, and it's woohoo, a cruel summer," which is Cruel Summer by Taylor Swift. August 13th, 2018, a man named Chris Watts killed his entire family. At first, on the day of Monday, August 13th, 2018, he said that his wife, Shanann, had run off with their two daughters, Bella, age 4, and Cece, age 3. But the very next day, after failing a polygraph test, it being pointed out to him that she had left all her personal effects behind at the house and her car, he adjusted his story to say that he had strangled Shanann shortly after her arrival home from a much-delayed flight out of Phoenix after he watched her murdering the girls during the early morning hours over a baby monitor. His next version of this story was that he had strangled Shanann shortly after her arrival home from the much-delayed flight out of Phoenix during an argument in bed in the early morning hours that got out of hand. He then murdered the girls. In yet another version, he claimed that after strangling Shanann, he attempted to strangle or suffocate both of the girls, but failed. They woke up again. He then forced them alive into 2 oil tanks at Anadarko, Survey 319, where he worked, except that there were no signs of strangulation or smothering on either of the girls' bodies, and Chris ordinarily did not work at Survey 319. Over the years, his stories have evolved and changed, and I haven't got a clue why, because none of them is entirely true. Perhaps I should know why, because I literally wrote a book on this horrific murder case, but I don't, except that my current theory is that, in all his stories, he was trying to hide the significant involvement of his girlfriend, Nicole Kessinger, in the events of July and August 2018 that led up to the murders of Shanann, Bella, and Cece Watts during the night of August 12th to 13th, 2018. My belated realization, many of you got there first, that I should not have dismissed out of hand the possibility, even probability, of Chris's girlfriend, Nicole Kessinger, being an instigator, accomplice, or accomplice after the fact in this family annihilation has forced me to return to Watts Island. And it was wittily called at the time to describe a band of delusional people who believed that Chris Watts was innocent of the murders when he was, in fact, already admitting to them. It couldn't have been Chris who committed the murders. He was too anodyne, too clueless, too good-looking, too boy next door. His wife Shanann must have driven him to it by provoking him beyond his endurance. His girlfriend, Nicole Kessinger, must have driven him to it, or even done the whole thing herself. Chris's sister might have played a part too. And because the inhabitants of Watts Island were so delusional and seemingly misogynist, I needed to dismiss the idea that Chris's girlfriend, Nicole Kessinger, was anything more than a hapless, maybe besotted mistress who inadvertently got involved with a married man, who independently decided to destroy his whole family in order to be with her. This was after I entertained, then rejected, the notion that Shanann Watts might have been a ball-breaking harridan and that Chris's sister might have had anything whatsoever to do with anything that went down that August. I was also speaking to Cindy Watts, Chris's mother, for hours almost daily during that time. Cindy clearly hated Shanann and was troubled by the fact that Chris had confessed to her several times that he had killed Shanann and the girls for no reason she could think of other than that Shanann was just plain awful. And was Shanann's unborn child really Chris's? She had her theory as to who was the real father, too. Chris had been such an easy child. Yes, he had been mean to her because he was thick as thieves with her own mother, the woman I nicknamed Grandma Nazi, although not to Cindy's face. Yes, Chris's sister thought Chris was autistic. Yes, Chris never had any close friends apart from his best friend, Mark. But Shanann. From my side, I repeatedly referred to Chris as that filthy child killer, and Cindy would agree that Chris had indeed killed Shanann and the girls. Then, the very next day, she would say that she couldn't believe that Chris had really killed them or Shanann had asked for it. Our conversations became a continuous cycle of Chris is guilty and Chris could not possibly have been guilty. Around and around for days, weeks, and even months on end. And yet, Cindy never pointed the finger at Nicole Kessinger for having had any potential involvement in the murders. She never discussed her at all. So the inhabitants of Watts Island were crazy, blaming any women they could think of for being responsible for the murders, but not Chris. Cindy was also crazy, and that she knew from the horse's mouth that her son had committed the murders, but was often in full-on denial, without suspecting Nicole Kessinger. And I decided to give Nicole Kessinger a pass without thoroughly examining the evidence, although the full scale of the evidence against her was not much around at the time. Only the fact that Nikki's cell phone had pinged close to the Watts home in the early morning hours of Monday, August 13th, which the police dismissed as being some kind of a false ping, whatever that meant. There was some intense scrutiny of Chris's neighbor's security tape that was raising issues, but the recordings of the CBI interviews with Nikki were released later, and the only awkward questions about Nikki and her story only built up over time. by which time I had moved on to another case. And I'm kicking myself for that now. Many of you stayed the course, and it was only recently that I started paying attention to what Kelly of Watts the Obsession and y'all were saying, and I started thinking, wait a minute. I did not have a clue who coined the apt little tag of Watts Island, but the first time I heard it, I laughed. Was it a play on an old TV show, which I think you can still catch on Nickelodeon, Gilligan's Island, which is about a hapless crew who set out on a 3-hour cruise and got stuck forever on an island they couldn't escape? That show is a comedy, whereas on Watts Island, you get stuck there forever, but it's never funny, except for the black humor sheer awfulness of it all. If you have a dark sense of humor, which I do. Anyway, here I am on my return trip to Watts Island, and I'm here because I think Nikki was allowed to get off the island when she and Chris Watts both deserve to rot on a real island called Watts Island with each other forever, with Alcatraz and Riker Islands as backups. Chapter 3. As I write this book, time will pass and things will happen. Life, right? As a case in point, it's April 1st, 2025 today, and I'm studying pictures from January of someone who looks a lot like Nicole Kessinger. There she blows. She doesn't look great. She's pale and puffy and walks like an ice road trucker. And she's not the slinky girl who drove Chris Watts intentionally or unintentionally to do the unthinkable any longer. I'm glad of that much. Of course, we can contrast whatever difficulties she may have faced over the last years, and who cares, with what happened to the victims. This coming summer, on July 17th, 2018, Cece, that life-loving, laughter-filled little girl, would be turning 10. She had a rare courage, that small one. And one of my favorite quotes is, "Courage is a virtue from which all other virtues spring." There were oceans to swim in and mountains to climb for her, and Chris Watts and possibly Nicole Kessinger decided she should die instead. Her beloved mother, her future little brother, and her older sister, whom she loved most of all, were also slaughtered. Whatever Chris Watts had said, and everything he says contradicts everything else he has ever said, the truth is that Cece died first, and that is the only comfort I've ever been able to find in this awful, awful case. I can assure you that if she hadn't gone ahead of them, Chris Watts would have a lot of marks on his body. She would have fought and lost. She was, after all, just 3 when she died. But she would have fought back the best she could. It's easy to see what an amazing woman she was going to grow up to be. But at the time of her death, she wasn't thinking any of that. I think, for her, just a chance to turn 4, like her sister, sounded good. A dream that would come true. Cece Watts died from a combination of assorted poisons. Her father, whom she loved, was a terrible combination of petulance, self-pity, and cowardice. This toxic mix isn't so different or less dangerous than Benadryl, rat poison, and paint thinner mix you can use to cook up some meth with. A mix that will put snakes in your head. The kind of snakes Chris Watts must have had in his head for months, maybe years, before he destroyed his family. Amid this stew of interior poisons, he conjured up the idea that the only way to rid himself of what he saw as a set of insoluble problems was to eliminate his whole family. Cece also died as a result of a woman's envious desire to take her father away from her mother. And we all know what a toxin envy is. Lastly, Cece died of a very famous and widely used poison, good old opiates. I say opiates because I'm so sick of comments from people arguing whether it was OxyContin or oxycodone or Percocet or Norco or whatever. All opiates are synthetic heroin, and 3-year-olds die easily if they are fed them. So please consider this. Whoever obtained the opiate that Chris Watts used on Cece and Bella that Sunday night of August 12th, 2018, killed Cece, period. No arguments. And if you think I'm ignoring the fates of Shanann and Nico, let me address that now. God bless that beautiful woman Shanann and her baby. I think of them almost every day. They are a terrible loss. And again, in a place lacking comfort, I try to find something to be okay with. This isn't much, but I remain glad that Nico died inside his mother, who loved him. His father certainly didn't. Despite Chris Watts' unusual attempts at playing Mr. Nice Guy about the pregnancy, "Little Peanut, I love you already," as he proclaimed to the camera, he did not want Nico to live to see daylight. He poisoned him and his mother twice to end them both, then realizing that he was not having much success, in line with the rest of his life story, he just put his hands around Shanann's neck and finally took Nico's life, along with his mother's, before he could have one. Shanann died in a terrible and painful way. Apparently, being strangled takes 2 to 4 minutes, and I'm glad it wasn't longer, although it's small comfort to her family, I realize. And Bella, oh, she is hard to write about, so I haven't, and I didn't want to. And I don't want to. I will, just let me get there slowly. I know all of you understand, and I will totally understand if you just want to skip that part of the book. I would too. Well, in the meantime, here's an idiotic statement from District Attorney Michael Rourke regarding this case. Quote, "If there were problems with Nicole Kessinger's story, we didn't investigate them because Chris Watts confessed." End quote. Oh, I see. But the thing is that I don't see. District Attorney Rourke also didn't want to be part of the witch hunt. I get it, nor did I. But he knew a lot more than I did about Nicole Kessinger. At the time, he must have had some pretty towering suspicions as to her involvement in the murders. So what stopped him with investigating her anyway? The blanket indemnity he had given her on the instant, without a moment's thought or inquiry, was it politics, pure laziness, or fiscal conservatism? Investigations cost money. Justice costs money. And justice, like climate change, something a career politician says pays lip service to, justice has a ring to it. But in a politician's mouth, it just as often clanks. Justice just is not. Chapter 4. Here in our lovely country and in other countries, sometimes a couple or more freaks get together and kill innocent people. I'm thinking of Canada's so-called Ken and Barbie killers, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. They were a particularly disgusting pair of psychos who kidnapped, sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered 3 young girls, one of them Karla Homolka's younger sister, Tammy. Paul, at least, is in prison for life. Karla, or Carly Curls, as she's referred to herself, was freed after 12 years, and that's because perceived wisdom in that case went like this. If Carly Curls hadn't hooked up with Paul, she probably never would have killed anyone, so let her go. So long as she turns state's witness, and at least one of them gets locked up for more or less ever. It's a deeply compromised approach to justice, yes, but I've been thinking about them as I write this book, because there are parallels there, interesting ones. If a stronger personality in a couple can drive the weaker, stupider one to kill, and say if Nicole Kessinger was in on the killing of the Watts family, then which of the two would you consider to be stronger, smarter one in the relationship? Regarding the Ken and Barbie killings, a few weeks after Karla was given her sentence, the authorities found a videotape of her joyously participating in the torture and killing of all 3 victims. But indemnity deals are a real bitch, and Karla's deal stood. So I wonder what the deal Nikki was offered, and no one seems to know. So that the state of Colorado did not even bother to investigate her involvement in the murders because Chris Watts confessed, so we closed the case? Heck, let's go old school. Susan Atkins, a member of the Manson family, confessed to participating in the Sharon Tate murders. So why did the state of California go to all the trouble of putting Charles Manson, Tex Watson, Patricia Kernwinkle, and Leslie Van Houten in the prison when they already had one confession, that of Susan Atkins? Sure, the rest of them were murderers too, but if the rule is that one confession is enough, why did the state bother with the rest of them? In the Watts case, there were 4 dead people, if you count the baby Shanann was carrying, and I do. And these 4 victims were young women, 2 tiny girls, and a baby boy named Nico sheltering in his mother's womb. Ugly, heinous, pick a phrase, any will do. But okay, Chris Watts confessed, so it was, quote, nothing more to see here, folks, end quote. Except after Chris Watts' confession and plea deal, some stuff came up that maybe required a closer look at this matter, which prompted the state of Colorado to do just that, kind of. Police departments, or so we hear, are always overstretched and under-budgeted, etc., etc. and things might get missed. Well, not in the case of parking tickets or failure to signal, because they bring in revenue. But murder, for example, when a big-ass case hits, and except for O.J. Simpson, there hasn't been a bigger case than Chris Watts, you now get a multitude of amateur civilian detectives flexing their hands and their eyes and their intellects thanks to all the transparency of the internet age. With the internet to discover the absolute truth, YouTube, Reddit, and podcasts are teeming with people who pore over pieces of footage available and who read and publish discovery with serious intensity. The truth must out, and these people are content to invest hundreds of hours of their lives obsessively in this quest. It's remarkably and humbling thing to watch. This stuff didn't exist during the time of O.J. Simpson's murder trial, but it sure did at the time of the Watts case. And among these people with some stuff caught, the state of Colorado missed big time. If you've ever been on Watts Island, one of the first tragic comic moments took place the afternoon following Shanann's disappearance. Chris Watts and a detective were invited next door to watch some Ring camera footage that the neighbor had recorded. It showed Chris Watts' truck being backed up in his double garage and Watts himself loading stuff into it. The footage was dark and it had been recorded in the pre-dawn hours. You could tell Chris Watts was loading stuff into it, but beyond that, at first glance, you didn't even notice what it was he was loading. The detective didn't, the neighbor didn't, but Chris Watts sure did. He went from cocky and vaguely uninterested in the tape to having complete meltdown in seconds. He put his hands on the top of his head and swayed back and forth like he had just taken a punch to the head from Mike Tyson. What he didn't do is to look at the footage. Interesting. The detective and the neighbor seemed to just conclude that the guy was under pressure and weird as hell, but others saw more. They saw a shadow walk down the driveway before the truck was backed in. They saw long legs and jeans and a ponytail. The footage got enhanced, and despite the state having a confession and a sentence on Chris Watts, they could no longer ignore what was on the tape. Well, again, kind of, sort of. In a move unprecedented in the annals of true crime, Chris Watts' original detectives flew out to Wisconsin in the winter to visit him at his new prison. He'd been moved to Wisconsin because his fellow inmates in Colorado were just super mean to him and kept suggesting ways in which he might kill himself, which naturally hurt his feelings. And so off he was sent to Wisconsin to a safer, more relaxing prison. Owing this move, these put upon detectives had to go to Wisconsin in February, and nobody wants to do that. In addition, they had to be nice and a sort of hat in hand during their visit because they knew, and more importantly, he knew, that he didn't have to answer one single question if he didn't feel like it. After all, as District Attorney Rourke had pointed out, he had confessed, so there was nothing more to see. But the state of Colorado was embarrassed. How did it miss the shadow of the woman walking down the driveway? How did it miss the additional pair of legs loading the truck? Well, funnily, they never asked then, and have never asked since, about the shadow with a ponytail or the other legs. They only asked about the small shadow belonging to one of the victims. Maybe Chris Watts was bored. Maybe he thought it was funny that they had all come all this way to finally ask him if maybe the crime hadn't gone down the way they thought it had, the way he said it had, not in court, not in writing, not in an official way, but during a post-polygraph chat. And my gist of the story originally, as I mentioned in the beginning, was as follows. Shanann came home one night from her flight and got in bed and we had sex. And then I woke her up about an hour later and I told her I still didn't feel very connected to her. This made her mad, but I didn't have any more time to discuss it because I needed to get ready for work. I went downstairs and started making my lunchbox up, and there was a baby monitor on the counter down there. And oh no, I saw Shanann was going in and out of the girls' rooms to kill them. I ran upstairs, but it was too late. They were both dead. So then I was madder at Shanann than she was at me, so I strangled her to death in revenge. After that, I was kind of at loss, and I still needed to get to work, so I loaded up the dead bodies and drove them to Survey 319, where I had scheduled repair. Once out there, I really didn't know what to do with them, so I dug a shallow grave for Shanann, and then, because I was still mad at her about killing the girls, I didn't think she deserved to have them buried with her, so I put them in separate oil tanks. I guess looking back at the whole thing, Shanann must have found I was having an affair and she got super mad, and that's why she killed the girls. So I do feel responsible for putting her into such an emotional state. Naturally, you can understand, with such a compelling confession, the state was ready to call this crime solved. Except that they need Chris Watts to admit to killing the girls too before they could talk to a judge. Okay, he obliged and fabricated story 2, the gist of which was Shanann came home, they had sex, she asked if he was having an affair, and he confessed that he was, and she cried and cried and cried, and her mascara ran all over her face. And then she got nasty and told him she'd never see the kids again. So then he got mad and strangled her, and she lost bowel control, so he knew he'd killed her. Oops. Feeling bad for his now motherless children, he went to their rooms and either strangled them or smothered them with blankets. He wasn't sure. But at least he knew he had mercy killed them one way or another. Chris Watts is a regular Dr. Kevorkian in this scenario. Do you remember the beautiful little dead Gabby Petito? Her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie, also mercy killed her. She, it seems, had fallen into a 6-inch deep creek, gotten severe hypothermia, despite the 100+ degree weather, so, like Chris Watts before him, he strangled her to keep her from her misery. Chris Watts is, if possible, an even bigger loser than Brian Laundrie because, by his own admission, he somehow failed to mercy kill his 2 tiny children because he was in a hurry and still had to get to work and get his lunchbox ready. Amazingly, this story worked for the state of Colorado despite incontrovertible evidence that he had successfully killed an adult woman by strangling her but failed to kill his tiny children. Oh well, it's best not to look at this tale too hard. The authorities never did. As a reward for making up this blatantly stupid story, he was spared the death penalty, which he never would have received anyway because the state of Colorado doesn't kill people. But anyway, in gratitude for his open, honest confession, he was sentenced to 5 life sentences and shipped off to Wisconsin in hope, I think, that this whole sordid tale would be forgotten. The Rusick family, Shanann's family, are lovely people, and like most law-abiding people, they trust the authorities. So when they were given this last completely ridiculous tale by the state, they accepted it. Or maybe they just didn't care anymore. Their lives were destroyed anyway. Or maybe this. They accepted this story because they didn't know what the state knew. What I knew, what the Watts family knew, which is that Chris Watts had tried to murder Shanann previously at least twice before he finally pulled it off. The summer she was killed, Shanann, pregnant and tired with 2 toddlers, had flown back home to stay with her family in North Carolina for a 6-week-long visit. And her husband was scheduled to join his family for the last week to see the girls and the ocean, etc. He had been enjoying the previous weeks with his hot new girlfriend, Nichol Kessinger, but he traveled to North Carolina anyway. He took opiates with him, ground them up, put them in Shanann's milkshake, and their very first night together. She became violently ill, but did not die. He later said that he had done this to cause her to miscarry. I cover this all in my book, Blood and Marriage, but it's not worth revisiting because, number one, opiates are not in any way, shape, or form an abortifacient. They are just a form of heroin, and they can kill someone. Just ask Eric Richins from my last book, Dream House. Except you can't because he drank an opiate cocktail and he is dead. So yes, they can kill and they do kill, but they are still not an abortifacient, beyond their ability to murder a pregnant mother and thereby the embryo. But that was never Chris Watts' sole plan. The opiates were to kill her. Chris Watts and quite possibly Nicole Kessinger just wanted her gone, erased. Shanann, not that unborn baby, was the one who was going to end their happy little love story, and it was her that the drugs were meant to take out. Ending the life of the unwanted by them baby was just a bonus, or maybe they didn't even think of him at all. It was Nico who was going to make a post on Facebook or throw a gender reveal party, or more probably, called Chris's employer Anadarko to out the adulterous affair of two work colleagues. Nico was not going to plaster the titillating details of their sleazy affair all over social media. Nope, that would have been Shanann doing that, and she needed to be silenced. Do you think a miscarriage would have solved all of Chris and Nikki's problems? Nope, me neither. Millions of opiate-using women give birth, and the long-term effects of this on the infants can vary and are still being studied. But the very fact that these born addict babies are born alive shows that opiates are not used to cause miscarriages. I don't know, can't know if Chris Watts ever believed that opiates could cause miscarriages or not, but you'd have to be pretty stupid to think so. Although, in fairness to him, he is indeed pretty stupid. However, his great love, Nichol Kessinger, didn't seem particularly stupid, and she knows her way around a Google search. This was not an attempted abortion, it was an attempted murder. And because of that, the state of Colorado's failure to find or even look for the source of the opiates used by Chris Watts on his wife Shanann is a glaring failure, in that if it wasn't Chris Watts who obtained them and did so for the sole purpose of killing Shanann and subsequently the baby she carried, then who was it and why weren't they charged? I can't even imagine that Chris Watts would have the wherewithal or time or money to doctor shop for what were by then very hard drugs to obtain. So did he buy them off the dark web? Maybe. But wouldn't that have come up in the computer history and or his banking history? Besides, Chris Watts was broke as a joke and opiates are not free. The state could have had him on transporting these drugs and administering them to Shanann in her parents' house. And these would have been federal charges, but no federal charges were filed. Worse, Chris Watts and whoever obtained the opiates for him were obviously undeterred by the initial failure to kill Shanann with them, because 3 days before he actually killed Shanann with his bare hands, he tried poisoning her again, this time by lacing her shake with opiates before her flight to Phoenix on Friday, August 10th. Once again, Shanann was violently ill, but the opiates didn't kill her or little Nico. Back when I wrote my first book on this case, I even used to wish they had, although obviously I wished even more that none of this had ever happened. But since it did, I once thought that if he had succeeded in poisoning her to death during either of the first two attempts on her life, she would have been spared what happened to her later during the early morning of Monday, August 13th. I also thought that it might have saved the lives of those two little girls. What he should have done was to confess his affair with Nichol Kessinger to his parents when he was in North Carolina after failing to kill Shanann the first night. As indeed he did confess to his parents the next day that he had fed Shanann opiates. I realized he wouldn't and didn't confess to poisoning Shanann to her parents, as Shanann's sweet but fierce little Italian mama probably would have killed him on the spot, or at least called the police. Not only did Chris Watts feel zero hesitation in continuing with his plan to kill Shanann and Nico, following his bold poisoning attempt on his wife in her own parents' house, he didn't even seem to worry about getting caught. He told his own parents he probably knew they wouldn't say anything, and they didn't. Chris Watts is a big football fan, so maybe he did a little Monday morning quarterbacking on the question of why his attempt failed. And maybe he talked to his mistress, Nicole Kessinger, about it as well during his day with his family. I know from his mother, Cindy Watts, that in between confessing to her and her husband about his attempt to make Shanann miscarry with an opiate overdose, he was on the phone all day, texting so much that Cindy had asked him if he had a girlfriend. He denied it, and he didn't resist Cindy's subsequent suggestion that he write a letter saying that if anything happened to him or the girls, it was probably his wife Shanann who had done the deed. He had laid out the groundwork that day for his later first confession that Shanann was a husband-killing, kid-killing wacko. Was that when he decided that his daughters needed to go as well? Did he decide that then as well? No, I don't think so. but he may have wanted it to remain a possibility. As for Nicole Kessinger's involvement in his first attempt on Shanann's life, well, let's look into some things that might create suspicion that she was in the know. At the time of Chris Watts' first attempt, he wasn't even speaking to his family, but apparently his failure to kill Shanann, or maybe all his nervous excitement around what he had done, had taken a toll on him. After all, as far as we know, this was his first attempted murder. And it seemed to agitate him so much that he decided to see his parents and sister again. Also that he could unburden himself to the people he trusted. But that same day, he confessed to them and wrote a letter pointing to Shanann's possible future guilt of killing him and their 2 children. He was on the phone with Nicole Kessinger all day, nonstop texting. If District Attorney Rourke had done his job, if the cops had sweated Nicole Kessinger just a little bit, if they had gone back on phone records, both hers and his, for July 31st and the day he arrived in North Carolina and the day he poisoned his wife, for August 1st, the day he wrote the accusatory letter while in nonstop communication with Nicole Kessinger, what would they have seen? Why didn't District Attorney Rourke and company choose to investigate the first murder attempt a mere 2 weeks before the actual murder attempts on August 12th to the 13th, and 10 days before the second poisoning attempt, or did they? Did they investigate this and decide not to proceed with the findings? After all, it is really hard to imagine that Chris Watts didn't keep Nicole Kessinger in the loop about the failed killing and then about the letter he was writing, warning people about Shanann's murderous nature. Chris Watts is not a decision maker. Look at his entire existence up until the summer of 2018, when he became a family annihilator. Perhaps prior to that, he had never once made a move that his grandmother, father, or Shanann hadn't decided for him. So it's a little difficult to believe that the single first major decision of his life was to slaughter his entire family. It's much easier to believe that someone told him to, and that his intimidatable, go-along, get-along way, he just did it. Like the Nike commercial says, just do it. Maybe you don't agree. Maybe you don't think anyone would do something that horrible just because he was told to. But that is how Chris Watts has lived his entire life. Blow his life savings on a ring? Sure, why not? Shanann told him that she wanted it. Quit his job and leave everything he knew to go live in some stranger's basement, half a world away. His boo said to do it, and so he did. Throw his entire career in the automotive field out the window because Shanann said he had carpal tunnel syndrome? Yep, he did that too. Take a job as an outfield roughneck for almost half his previous salary, a field where he used his supposedly damaged wrist at least as much as he did working on cars. Cindy Watts told me that Shanann had told him to go do that too, so he would have more regular hours. Pathetic, yes, but I believe it, because despite my very fond feelings for that girl, I acknowledge that Shanann just sucked at managing money. Next up, apply for lots of credit cards and throw an expensive wedding halfway across the country. Yes, ma'am, that's what Shanann said to do. And after that, why not agree to buy a humongous house for his family that they could never afford? Well, he did that too, because he was told to. And the list goes on, but I'll stop there, having hopefully made my point. I have to add, though, that after a lifetime of being given bad instructions and blindly obeying them without once questioning anything about them, he did finally, at long last, get annoyed enough to announce, "She wouldn't even let me hang a picture on the wall." That was what finally annoyed him? Oh my God! Right from the get-go, Nicole Kessinger also told him what to do. But in the beginning, her orders were pleasant. He was enjoying going along with his new boss. Go camping? Oh yeah. Go to car shows and NASCAR? Oh golly gee, yeah. Anal sex and threesomes? You betcha, baby. Discard your family? Well, why not? If Chris Watts was capable of thinking for himself, then all he had to do after failing to kill Shanann, and the first time, was nothing. He could have confessed to his affair with Nicole Kessinger in person or by text or by FedEx, or have his mom tell Shanann's mom all about it, or whatever. He could have chosen his preferred avoidant way to end his relationship with Shanann and gone back home to Colorado. Or he could have just even said yes to the one person in his life that he was ironically always able to refuse, his mother, when she asked him if he was having an affair. Cindy Watts, who is not a killer, saw something, sensed something. That day at the beach when Chris Watts went through his prodigal son returning home routine, or maybe, like anyone who isn't a stone-cold criminal, she got seriously alarmed at his confession to her of his attempted murder of his wife the night before. Cindy, unlike her son, is not an idiot. She added up the strange visit, the constant texting, and his confession, and saw something huge and dark coming their way. You don't ask your kid to write down a letter about the possibility of being killed by his wife for no reason. He said yes to Cindy's request, true, but he said no to Cindy's pleas to allow her to fly back to Colorado with him. Consider how desperate Cindy must have been to even ask to go to Colorado with him. She knew Shanann would have had a fit, and she and Shanann hadn't exchanged a single word since an incident in Cindy's house where they got into a big scene over Cindy giving Cece ice cream, the so-called Nutgate incident, which was followed by Shanann's wacko Facebook posts where she intimated that Cindy had nearly killed Cece. This was all very recent, and Cindy knew that, at best, she wouldn't be welcome, and at worst, that the visit would be unbearable. I didn't ask her much back then about her desire to go to Colorado. I didn't ask the questions I should have, like, why would you put yourself through that? And why did you really think that might happen? I took her explanation that she suggested it so that someone could take care of the girls while Chris and Shanann were sorting things out between them or settling their separation and divorce. But Cindy had to have known Shanann was clueless. Otherwise, why the beach vacation? Why was she planning to return to Colorado at all? Cindy would have known, too, that her mere presence would have made Shanann even angrier, if indeed Cindy believed her son at all about his plans to separate and get his own place. Chris Watts never knew his mother. He didn't bother to, but she knew him. She knew he had a taste for bossy women in Shanann's case and cruel women in his grandmother's case. Sweet women like his mother and sister were not his kind, and she knew what all the texting meant. She knew that he didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide to get rid of Shanann and Nico. And she knew, at least certainly worried, that there was a new woman's voice in her son's head, and it sounded like a dangerous one. At the time when Cindy asked him if there was another woman, he denied it. She clearly didn't believe him because she told him he couldn't have a pregnant woman and 2 small children and expect any good to come out of it. These moral points were, of course, lost on Chris Watts, as they were on Nichol Kessinger. Do you remember her "are we bad people?" question? It was rhetorical. She had no intention of getting out of the way. Now, I don't know for certain that Nichol Kessinger murdered Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico alongside their definitely guilty father, but I do know this. At no point, not even once, did she give a shit about those little girls or their mother, who she knew very well was pregnant. At the very least, she was willing to destroy Shanann's life and those of the little girls by taking away from them their husband/father, their home, their schools, their entire way of life. Do you remember her Colorado Bureau of Investigation non-interrogation, where she attempted to act like she cared about the murdered children? Where she spread her hands apart and said, "They were so little! How could he?" Good question. Millions and millions of people have been asking that since August of 2018. But I have a question, and this is just for Nikki. How could you have been willing to hurt them and destroy their future so badly? You never met them. They were just little girls. They hadn't done anything to you. Your vile lover being married, having fathered them, that wasn't their fault. So why, Nikki, were you so willing to smash everything that mattered to them? We know Nikki was willing to do this, and we also know that after Chris Watts' first failed attempt on Shanann and Nico, which she may have known about and may indeed have contributed to by supplying the opiates, she was still willing to trash the girls' lives. Do you remember her endless bullshit comments to the CBI? I told him to spend time with his wife and his kids while they were in North Carolina and try to fix things. That was absolutely not true, and the cops had her phone, but they didn't once contradict her. They had Chris Watts' phone with the records of endless texts and phone calls between them for that time, but she wasn't asked about this glaring lie. Worse, neither was Chris Watts. They obviously wanted to keep her in the clear. Perhaps we shouldn't amend Nicole's statement to read, "They were so little, how could I?" It's kind of funny, well, not that funny, that the time of my writing this, the second Karen Read case is taking place in Massachusetts. It looks like a stitch-up to me, conducted for the police by the police and aided by a true loon of a judge. I don't think Karen Read did a thing wrong beyond drinking alcohol. Well, I think Nicole Kessinger may have been complicit all the way down the line. But in topsy-turvy, opposite land, the Colorado cops have had to work as hard to make Nicole Kessinger look innocent as the vigilance in Boston worked to make Karen Read look like a murderer. As for Nicole Kessinger, oops, she did it again. And oops, the cops let her get away with it again. In one of her CBI sessions, interrogations, quote, would be too misleading a word. She told Agent Kevin Kobach that she was very involved in helping Chris Watts find an apartment. Huh? Does that seem like someone trying to save a marriage and a family? It seems more like some serious controlling behavior. You do this stuff now, today, immediately. But Kevin Kobach didn't ask, so she cheerfully went on. I told him once he had an apartment, we could have a more normal relationship, maybe even slow things down. Okay, so in other words, if he destroyed the Watts family's lives, including that of the baby on the way, she promised to relax a little. These were harsh terms to keep Nikki happy. Well, harsh for a family of innocents, but not a lot of stress for Nikki. And definite stress for Mr. I do what I am told when I am told Watts. And there wasn't much of a payoff for anyone but Nikki either. Chris and Nikki's speeded up relationship to this point was why Nikki was doing stuff Chris wanted and giving him the best sex of his life. All that would come from making the Watts family homeless, and I imagine quite upset, was that Chris and Nikki's relationship could reset and being the kind of relationship Nikki really wanted, and I bet the anal sex would have been quickly replaced with group yoga sessions and increased domestic responsibilities. He would have been trading Shannan's sweet, if bossy ways for the requirements of a whole other sheriff in town. And we have to ask whether he would have liked that more, whether he would have felt less sorry for himself, or whether he would have been allowed to hang lots and lots of car and Metallica pictures on the wall. Or would that not be quite how things would have turned out? I'm not a psychologist, but Nicole Kessinger seems to have at least sociopathic elements to her character. And the job of sociopaths is not usually to create comfortable relationships. Quite the opposite.